What happens when a spoiled rich kid thinks he's above the law? Ethan Rowland walked into court that day with a smirk, certain he'd walk right back out, but in just 30 minutes, he would be led away in handcuffs. This is the story of how privilege finally met justice. The Franklin County Courthouse was unusually crowded that morning. The air was thick with anticipation, a quiet but undeniable tension pressing against the walls of the courtroom. Reporters lined the back rows, their pens poised, ready to document every word. Spectators filled the seats, some murmuring in hushed voices, others simply watching, waiting. This wasn't just another reckless driving case. This was the trial of Ethan Rowland, the 19-year-old son of billionaire real estate mogul William Rowland. He was young, he was rich, and from the way he carried himself, he had no fear of consequences. Then he walked in. Ethan Rowland strolled into the courtroom like he owned it. His expensive sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. A silver chain dangled over his designer hoodie, the same one he had been seen wearing on social media just days before his arrest. A few reporters whispered to each other as they watched him, exchanging knowing glances. He looked exactly as they had imagined, entitled, arrogant, untouchable. Ethan didn't acknowledge the murmurs or the piercing stares. Instead, he popped a piece of gum into his mouth, chewing slowly, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenience. His lawyer, James Mercer, a seasoned defense attorney with years of experience, followed close behind. Mercer's face was tight, his eyes flickering between his client and the judge's bench. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy day. As Ethan approached his seat, he didn't rush. He took his time, scanning the room with mild curiosity, as though he were a spectator, not the accused. His smirk deepened as he caught sight of the people watching him. A few feet away, seated in the second row, was a man with his right arm in a sling. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his expression held no anger, only quiet disappointment. Diego Alvarez. The man Ethan nearly ran off the road, but Ethan didn't linger on him. He looked past him, as if the man didn't exist. Then he sat down, stretching his legs out in front of him, slouching into his seat like this was just another day. The courtroom doors swung open once more. William Rowland entered. If Ethan's arrival had been met with whispers, his father's presence demanded silent recognition. A tall, commanding figure in a perfectly tailored navy suit, William Rowland exuded the kind of power that needed no introduction. He walked with measured confidence, his leather briefcase in one hand, his other gripping a sleek, expensive phone. He didn't glance at his son, not even once. Instead, he murmured something into his phone, his voice calm, unaffected. Whatever was happening in this courtroom today, it was just another business meeting to him, another minor problem to be solved with money and influence. As he took his seat behind the defense table, he finally ended his call, slipping the phone into his pocket with a quiet sigh. Then he looked toward the judge's bench. There was no concern in his expression, no urgency, just quiet confidence. A look that said, "This is already taken care of." The courtroom was restless. The quiet murmur of reporters, the shuffling of papers, the low hum of spectators whispering among themselves. It was a tension that had been brewing long before the hearing even started. And then, the doors at the back of the chamber swung open. Silence. Judge Henry Porter entered. He didn't have to demand order. He didn't have to raise his voice. His presence alone did that. Tall, composed, with eyes that had seen every trick in the book, Judge Porter carried himself like a man who had earned his authority the hard way. He wasn't just another judge in a black robe. He was a man who had spent his entire career proving that justice wasn't reserved for the privileged, and right now his gaze was locked onto Ethan Rowland. The young man lounging in his chair, chewing gum, shoulders slumped as if this courtroom was just another place to pass the time. But for the first time that morning, something changed. Ethan felt it. It was a split-second hesitation, barely noticeable, but it was there, a flicker of something just beneath the surface. He sat up a little straighter, adjusting his posture before quickly catching himself, slouching back as if to say, "Whatever. No big deal." His father, William Rowland, however, remained completely unfazed. While the room shifted, while the weight of the moment settled onto everyone else, he simply crossed one leg over the other, adjusting his expensive cufflinks with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who had seen it all before. a man who believed no courtroom, not even this one, could truly challenge his influence. Judge Porter took his seat. He adjusted a few papers, methodical, unhurried. Then he looked up. His sharp eyes scanned the room, acknowledging the weight of what was about to unfold. He saw the reporters poised with their pens, the silent anticipation in the gallery. He saw Diego Alvarez sitting in the second row, his injured arm in a sling, his face worn but patient. And then he saw Ethan again. The smirk was back. The arrogance, the untouchable attitude, all right where it had been before. Ethan leaned back, popping his gum loud enough for the sound to cut through the quiet. A challenge, a test. Waiting to see if the judge would react. Judge Porter didn't. Instead, he simply watched. Not with anger, not with annoyance, but with a calm, unwavering certainty. The kind of certainty that said, I've dealt with men twice your size, with egos twice as inflated. You, Ethan Rowland, are not special. The weight of silence in the room grew heavier. The seconds stretched. Then, in a voice steady as iron, Judge Porter finally spoke. This court is now in session. The words weren't loud, they weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of finality. A statement that, from this moment forward, the law, not privilege, would decide Ethan Rowland's fate. A muscle flickered in Ethan's jaw. His smirk didn't waver, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly. And Judge Porter saw it. He let the silence linger for just a moment longer. Then, he opened the case file. And the real trial began. Ethan sat there, unmoved. For a moment, he just stared at Judge Porter, as if weighing whether or not he even needed to respond. Then, with a lazy shrug, he exhaled sharply through his nose. It's not that serious. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. A murmur rippled through the room, soft, uneasy. It wasn't outrage. Not yet. It was something worse. A slow-building disbelief. Judge Porter remained still. Then after a beat of silence, he spoke again. His voice was calm, unshaken. Mr. Rowland, do you understand the gravity of your actions? Ethan let out a slow, exaggerated breath. Not out of remorse, not out of concern, but out of boredom. Then, in a single fluid motion, he leaned back in his chair, arms stretching over the backrest, legs extending slightly forward, as if this was nothing more than a pointless lecture he was forced to sit through. And then came the smirk. The kind of smirk that made people in the room want to look away out of second-hand embarrassment. Because surely he wasn't that oblivious. Honestly? He tilted his head, dragging out the word like he was in on some private joke. Not really. This time, the reaction was louder. A shift in the gallery. A faint gasp. Someone whispering, "Did he really just say that?" A reporter near the back lowered his pen, shaking his head slightly, as if he had just witnessed a man dig his own grave. At the defense table, James Mercer closed his eyes for half a second, barely masking his frustration. His lips pressed into a firm line, his fingers curling slightly as if he was debating whether or not to physically restrain his own client. But Judge Porter, he didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't even shift. But the silence that followed, it was thick, weighted, crushing. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, because it spoke for itself. And for the first time since the hearing began, Ethan felt it. He didn't move, didn't react, but something in his eyes flickered. Just for a second. And Judge Porter saw it. He let the silence stretch for a beat longer. Then, at last, he reached for the next page in the case file. And the real consequences began. Judge Porter said nothing. He didn't argue, didn't lecture, didn't waste a single word trying to convince Ethan Rowland of the seriousness of his actions, because he didn't need to. With quiet authority, he simply lifted his hand and gave a single nod to the bailiff. A silent command. The bailiff stepped forward, retrieving a tablet from the evidence table before walking toward the judge's bench. The courtroom, already hushed, seemed to tighten, anticipation thickening the air like an approaching storm. Ethan watched lazily at first. Then, as the bailiff placed the tablet before Judge Porter, his smirk faltered. Just a fraction of an inch, so small that most wouldn't have noticed. But Judge Porter noticed. Without a word, he turned the tablet toward the courtroom and pressed play. A large screen behind him flickered to life, and the room went still. Traffic camera footage. A black BMW raced through a red light, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The timestamp in the corner read 9:32 p.m. March 14th. Then the moment arrived. The red light burned bright overhead. A cyclist, moving steadily in the designated bike lane. The BMW accelerating, closing the gap in seconds. Gasps broke the silence as the screen showed it clearly. Mr. Alvarez had no chance. At the last second, he swerved too fast, too sharp, his bike jerking violently to the right. The wheels lost traction. His body crashed into the curb, then the fire hydrant, then the pavement. The screen froze on that final brutal frame. Mr. Alvarez sprawled on the ground, unmoving. The footage had no sound, but the courtroom didn't need it. In the deafening silence, they could hear everything anyway. The screech of rubber, the sickening thud of impact, the sharp gasp of pain that hadn't even been recorded. Somewhere in the gallery, someone exhaled sharply. A woman near the back covered her mouth. Even the court reporter, who had been mechanically transcribing every word, had stopped typing. Ethan? His fingers tensed slightly against the table. But his face remained still. Too still. His father, William Rowland, who had sat through the proceedings with an air of practiced detachment, shifted ever so slightly. The first crack in his composure. But Judge Porter wasn't done. He turned his gaze to the bailiff. Play the second video. The next video began. This time from inside the car. A clearer feed, sharper. The dashboard glowing faintly under the city lights. A view of the road ahead. A view of the cyclist. And then, a view of Ethan. His hands gripping the wheel. His face, fully illuminated in the dim interior light. His expression. And the worst part? It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was amusement. Then the audio kicked in. A sharp honk, the cyclist swerving, the blur of motion as Mr. Alvarez lost control. And then, laughter. Not nervous laughter, not relief. Laughter of entertainment. And then his voice. Casual, carefree. Like this was nothing more than a joke. Damn, almost got him. The entire room recoiled, a physical reaction, as if the very words had weight pressing against them. Someone in the gallery inhaled sharply, a sharp, cutting sound in the otherwise frozen courtroom. At the defense table, James Mercer, Ethan's lawyer, went rigid. His fingers curled slightly against his papers, as if resisting the urge to physically restrain his own client. William Rowland, for the first time, looked away from his son. And Ethan? His jaw tightened. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in something dangerously close to fear. Because there was no spinning this, no talking his way out of it, no dismissing it as an exaggeration. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't speculation. This was his own voice, his own laughter, his own words. And now, they were the nails sealing his fate. Judge Porter let the silence stretch. Then, in a voice as calm as ever, he simply said, "Let the record show. This is the defendant's own recorded statement, taken from his personal vehicle at the time of the incident." He didn't need to say anything else. The courtroom had already passed its judgment. Ethan just didn't realize it yet. The silence was absolute. Not the kind of silence that comes from lack of noise, but the kind that weighs down on a room, pressing into the walls, suffocating the space between breaths. No one moved. No one spoke. The screen behind Judge Porter had gone dark, but the images remained burned into everyone's minds. The reckless acceleration, the crash, the laughter. Ethan Rowland sat frozen. His skin had lost its usual cocky glow, replaced by something paler, something bordering on panic. His hands, once carelessly draped over the table, now clenched into tight fists, his breathing slower now, more controlled. But his eyes told the truth. Wide, unfocused, like someone realizing too late that they've stepped off a cliff. And then, a sudden movement. From the second row, William Rowland pushed himself to his feet, sharp, abrupt, a movement that broke the thick tension like a blade slicing through glass. For the first time all morning, the billionaire father looked shaken. Not angry, not annoyed, but uncertain. His mouth opened, but for once no words came out. A hesitation, a single flicker of doubt. And then, he sat back down. Slowly, deliberately. As if in that single moment he had realized what everyone else in the room already knew. This wasn't something money could fix. This wasn't a negotiation. This was justice. And his son had just condemned himself. Judge Porter let the silence stretch. Let it settle. Let it sink into Ethan's skin, into his bones, into the very foundation of who he thought he was. Then, when the weight of it became unbearable, he leaned forward, his expression calm, his voice steady. And then, with the simplest of questions, he delivered the final blow. "Mr. Rowland, do you still believe this is not that serious?" The words landed like a hammer to the chest. No anger, no frustration, Just an invitation for Ethan to listen to the sound of his own arrogance echoing back at him. A reminder that, mere minutes ago, he had shrugged, laughed, mocked. Now there was nothing left to mock, nothing left to deflect, only the undeniable truth staring back at him. And for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Ethan Rowland had no response. Judge Porter let the silence linger, not to draw it out for effect, not to punish, but to make sure, absolutely sure, that Ethan Rowland felt the weight of what was about to come, felt it settle in his chest, felt it crush every illusion of invincibility he had ever known. Then, in a voice as steady as stone, he spoke. "Mr. Rowland, the court has reviewed the evidence, and it is clear that your actions were not just reckless, but completely devoid of regard for human life." Ethan sat stiff in his chair. He wasn't lounging anymore, wasn't smirking, wasn't chewing gum or leaning back like this was all just a minor inconvenience. Now he was just waiting for the inevitable. Judge Porter continued. "This court does not operate on privilege. It does not bow to wealth, nor does it make exceptions for those who believe they are above accountability." A pause, a slow, deliberate pause. Then, the verdict. "For the charge of reckless endangerment resulting in bodily harm, the court sentences you to 30 days in county jail. This is a real sentence. There will be no bail, no early release, no special privileges." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even though everyone had seen this coming, no one quite believed it until now. Ethan stiffened. His breath caught, his fingers gripping the table just slightly. Not enough to draw attention, but enough for Judge Porter to notice. And he wasn't done. "Additionally, you will complete 500 hours of community service. This will not be a mere formality. You will be assigned to a rehabilitation center where you will work directly with individuals who have suffered from traumatic injuries caused by reckless drivers." Ethan's head snapped up. That wasn't just a punishment. That was humiliation. That was forcing him to come face to face with the consequences of his own actions, every single day. Judge Porter's gaze was unwavering. "And lastly, your driver's license will be suspended for 1 year. You have demonstrated an absolute disregard for the responsibility that comes with operating a vehicle, and the court will not allow you to endanger anyone else." The finality of those words sank into the room like a stone dropped into deep water. No appeal, no negotiation, no easy way out. Ethan Rowland, the golden boy of privilege, the one who had walked into court convinced this would be nothing more than a slap on the wrist, was going to jail. And for the first time in his life, there was nothing he could do about it. For a long moment, Ethan Rowland didn't react, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. Then, he laughed. Not a full laugh. Not something loud or confident, just a short, hollow chuckle, a breath of amusement that barely touched his lips, like he had just heard a joke that wasn't particularly funny. His head tilted slightly, that familiar smirk creeping back in, the one that had carried him through life untouched. 30 days? He repeated, his voice light, almost casual. "Come on, Your Honor. You can't be serious." No one laughed with him. No one smiled. The silence only deepened. Judge Porter simply watched him, unmoving, unshaken. Then he lifted his gavel. Ethan's smirk didn't fade, not yet, because this was a mistake. This was going to be fixed. Any second now his father would stand, his lawyer would intervene, someone would. Thud. The gavel struck wood, final, irrevocable. Ethan's breath hitched, a small, sharp inhale, so fast he almost swallowed it. His eyes darted to the side, searching. His father, the man who had fixed everything his entire life, the man who had smoothed over every reckless mistake, the man who had made sure consequences were for other people, never for him. William Rowland didn't move. He sat there, stone-faced, his hands folded neatly in his lap, not out of anger, not out of defiance, but because for the first time in his life, he had no power here. And that's when it hit Ethan. This wasn't going away. He wasn't walking out of here today. He wasn't going to wake up tomorrow in his penthouse bed, shake this off like a bad memory. He was going to jail, for real. A slow, creeping dread coiled in his chest, tightening like a noose. His heartbeat pounded, too loud in his ears. His mouth opened, some instinctive, desperate plea forming on his tongue. But no words came out, because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to bargain with, nothing left to offer. For the first time in his life, Ethan Rowland had to face the reality he had spent years pretending didn't exist, and he wasn't ready. Not even close. The sound of metal clicking shut rang through the silent courtroom. Cold. Final. Ethan Rowland flinched. His wrists were now locked in handcuffs. The same hands that had once gripped the wheel of a luxury car speeding through a red light. The same hands that had once casually flicked away consequences like dust from his sleeve. Now they were bound together, restricted, controlled. For the first time in his life, Ethan Rowland wasn't in charge. A bailiff gripped his arm, nudging him forward. He resisted just for a second. A small, almost involuntary movement. Like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down, realizing too late that there was no way back. Then, step by step, he moved. The gallery watched in silence. Some whispered, reporters taking notes, court regulars murmuring among themselves. But one man didn't speak. One man didn't move. Diego Alvarez, the victim. The man whose life had been forever changed by Ethan Rowland's recklessness. He sat in the second row, his arms still in a sling, his body still bearing the weight of an accident that should have never happened. Ethan saw him and looked away. It wasn't arrogance this time. It wasn't defiance. It was something else, something heavier, something uncomfortable. But Mr. Alvarez? He didn't look away. He didn't sneer, didn't glare, didn't demand an apology that would never come. He just watched. Not with anger, not with hatred, just with disappointment. A quiet, piercing kind of disappointment that cut deeper than any words could. And for some reason, that made it worse. Ethan could have handled rage, could have handled someone shouting at him, cursing his name, blaming him for everything. But this was different. This was a man who had expected nothing from him, and had still been let down. And as Ethan was led past him, for the first time he felt the full weight of what he had done. And it was too late to change any of it. The chains on Ethan Rowland's wrists felt heavier now. He didn't fight, didn't struggle, didn't resist as the bailiff led him forward. Because there was no escaping this. For the first time in his life, he had to walk into a future he couldn't control. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. No cameras flashing, no murmurs filling the air. Just the heavy, crushing weight of consequence settling into place. Then, from the bench, Judge Porter's voice rang out. Calm, steady, unshaken. Money can buy a lot of things, Mr. Rowland. A pause. A heavy pause. But it cannot buy responsibility. Ethan's chest tightened. His hands already locked in cuffs curled slightly. Today, you will learn that. No anger, no gloating, just a statement of fact. And somehow, that made it even worse. The bailiff gave a slight tug on Ethan's arm. Time to go. Step by step, he moved forward. Not as the arrogant, untouchable teenager who had walked into this courtroom hours ago, but as a boy who was finally facing the weight of his actions. Fear flickered in his eyes, not because of jail, not because of the sentence itself, but because for the first time he was alone. There was no privilege to shield him, no father to pay his way out, no smirk, no shrug, no lazy confidence to fall back on. Just the cold reality of justice closing in. And then, the doors shut behind him, final. Irrevocable. And in that moment, Ethan Rowland was no longer above the law. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who believe in justice and accountability. Your support helps us continue creating powerful, thought-provoking stories that spark conversation and inspire change. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Every like, share, and comment fuels our passion to bring you more meaningful content. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey with us.